Yo, what's up? It's Ezra. You know that now if you're watching this. Um, I didn't do a video last week. My apologies. I had a lot going on between school and work, and just it seemed like an appropriate time to finally do that video about the emotional and mental changes that I went through starting testosterone. Um, Yeah, because that's a lot of why I wasn't able to make a video last week. And I'm going to try to remain consistent as I'm trying to get better with structure and balance and all that stuff. I'm trying to build that foundation for the rest of my life right now. Um, or at least a sort of model for me to go off of when I'm falling off balance. But yeah, so I guess I'm trying to figure out where to start. So before I started testosterone, I was diagnosed with bipolar 2, PTSD, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety. Um, and I'm also on the dissociative scale, which I guess everybody is to some extent, but it was pretty bad for me before I started testosterone. Um, so with that being said, testosterone did affect all of those things actually. Um, yeah. So one of the major things that I noticed, I know when I was watching videos during research before I started testosterone, a lot of folks said that they got angrier. I had a similar experience, but I wouldn't exactly describe it that way. It's not that I experienced any anger that I didn't feel prior to starting testosterone. It's just that it was more at the forefront of my emotive processes than it was before. I was very much so a suppressor with my anger, and I let it out heavily through art of some sort, singing, screaming, my bass, writing majorly. Those were a lot of my sources for letting out my anger because I didn't want to settle it in a violent manner. Um, and I mean, with any emotion, anger wasn't exactly at the forefront. Whereas now, when I go through things or I feel something, it's like there's kind of a blanket of anger on top of it, and I have to dig up under that to figure out what I'm actually feeling. And I think the knowledge that anger is a secondary emotion, I think they call it, that is saying that it's a response to some other emotion up under it. Gave me something to work with in terms of like figuring out, okay, I'm not the anger itself isn't what I need to respond to. There's something up under that that I need to deal with, that I need to process, that's causing the anger itself. um, yeah, so my anger was a lot more at the forefront of my emotive processes. It was kind of the first wall that I had to get through to figure out what else was going on. um, as far as and that leans actually directly into how testosterone affected my mood swings with me being bipolar. Um, it made me way more manic. Like my mood swings were intense when my hormones were not balanced. My mood was not balanced in any way. Like any small thing could turn into the biggest trigger, and I mean the largest trigger. Sometimes I was having mood swings and like flipping from being complete calm to super depressed to completely manic to like crazy angry, all within like a very small period of time. I won't say crazy angry. I'm not supposed to use that word. I'm working on it. But just intensely angry in a way that like I physically didn't know how to manage. Like there were physical responses coming out of me that I wasn't used to happening in a public space. Like I remember one particular time I was driving home from Steak and Shake, and I had to stop driving because I started crying and I got like super angry. And I don't know why. I was just driving. I ate, like I drank water that day. Everything was cool. It seemed. But I just started raging for some reason. I started screaming. I had to pull over to the side of the road and cry. And then after I cried, like everything was fine, but it was a lot going on. So after that point, I figured out. I called my doctor and I was like, "Yo, something's up. I don't know if it has anything to do with these hormones. 'Cause I know that they affect your emotions, and I know that the responses are very individual. They're based on the body and what you have already going on in your mind." So with that, we decided to lower my dosage at the time and make it more consistent. So instead of me doing a bi-weekly dosage, I did a weekly dosage of I think 50 milliliters. Um, And like I worked my way up after that. I'm doing 100 every week now. And I feel fine. I'm doing a lot better. I'm a lot more stable. I also started medication for that. I had a bit of an episode where I was feeling like extremely suicidal and just not in control of myself at all. And I knew that like that wasn't who I was and how I wanted to be emotionally, because it was driving my entire life. So I voluntarily went to the hospital, into a psych hospital. There's one outside of Grand Rapids. I don't remember the exact city it's in, but it's called Pine Rest. I went there and I got medicated. So I'm on Zoloft, 50 milligrams of Zoloft for depression, and 25 milligrams of Seroquel for sleep, mood stabilization, impulsivity, anxiety, all that good stuff in one little pill. And I was lucky, blessed, I'll say, because I figured out the medication that I needed on the first try, and that was back the last week of February, actually, first week of March, last week of February, that period, when I started my medication, and I've been on it since then, and I'm doing just fine now. But for a couple of weeks, almost a month actually, I couldn't afford my medication, and I didn't really have anybody to ask for the money. So I was off my meds for about 2 weeks, and I was off of my testosterone for about a month because I couldn't afford it. And then once I could afford it, the pharmacy was having issues getting my medication because I moved cities. I moved from Grand Rapids back to Detroit. So I had to like switch pharmacies, and then they were having issues getting my medication, getting my testosterone specifically, and then they were having some issue with the way the prescription was written, so they didn't know what bottle to get. It was something crazy. It was something ridiculous. But yeah, so the last like 2 weeks, I got the money for my medication. A wonderful professor of mine gave it to me. Shouts out to her. And I started taking it again, so I'm back on my hormones, I'm back on my psych meds. But it takes time for that stuff to like balance out in the body. And because of that, it took me about 2 weeks to adjust. So that means that everything was out of balance. My emotional responses to things weren't right. I was like every little thing, every little pebble felt like a whole mountain to me. And I knew that it wasn't the case, but I couldn't physically respond any differently. And that's part of why I didn't make a video last week, because I was mentally all over the place, and I was trying to make sure I got my homework done on top of trying to make sure I made it to every work shift and I got through every work shift. And I've also been trying to wean myself off caffeine and eat better and sleep better. So in the midst of doing all that at one time, my head was all over the place, and I completely forgot to make a video until I got home that night at like 9. And by that point, I had just gotten out of class, because on Wednesdays I have class from morning till 8:30. And yeah, by that time I was so tired, I was like, I can't. I'll just make sure I make a longer video next week talking about kind of a little bit of what I've been through emotionally since being on testosterone. Yeah. It's been a wild ride, because especially when I first started and my body was first getting used to being on testosterone. I mean, legitimately, because for me, the process that I did was my doctor started me out on the lowest dose possible and worked me up every 2 weeks. So I took, I think, 25 milliliters the first dose, and then 2 weeks later, 50, 2 weeks later, 75, 2 weeks later, 100. Then I stayed at 100 every 2 weeks for a while. That's a lot. I went from 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 150, and then 150 to 200. That was the process, the specific dosage. And then I was doing 200 every 2 weeks, and then I switched over to 50 every week, and then 100 every week. But I adjust it based on how my body and my mind feels weekly, because I don't know, my body goes through something where it processes it a little differently. So if I find myself raging a little more or a lot less in control of my mood, I try to make sure I'm drinking enough water, I'm eating often enough, and then I'll decide whether or not I need to adjust my dose. Which technically you're supposed to consult your doctor first, but I don't always have time to do that because my doctor's 3 hours away now. But yeah, especially the first couple months being on, emotionally, I was just in a whirlwind because I was already emotionally unstable, And then adding the testosterone on top of that, doing whatever it was doing in my brain, just made everything so much worse. And I didn't know until I actually talked to another trans guy friend of mine about it, asking if he had had those same issues with mood swings and mania and stuff like that. And he's bipolar too, and he told me, yeah, testosterone exacerbates all that stuff, so you have to talk to your doctor about your dosage. And I was like, all right, bet. I called my doctor literally the next morning at like 7:30. Like, hey doc, I need you to do something about this because I'm going mad and I can't keep doing this. I started testosterone to stay alive, and now like I feel like offing myself, and that's not right. But yeah, whew. I could talk about emotionally what happened to me on testosterone for a long time, because I still, like, I know a lot of folks try to say that testosterone cures depression. It does not. It just helps you deal with one thing that you were probably depressed about. Like, I was depressed about the way that people were perceiving me, and testosterone helped me with that. But at the end of the day, I still had depression. Testosterone did not cure that. The dissociative issues that I was having, I dissociate in general because all of my emotions are very intense. And sometimes my body just can't handle that. So it's like, we got to separate. You got to chill for a second. We'll come back to this later. And that happens not as often as it used to, especially with me being on meds and actually using a lot of the coping mechanisms that I was supposed to use to balance all this stuff out, and to just managing my emotions healthier in general, not even just coping, but learning to manage my emotions on a day-to-day, on an hourly basis, actually implementing all the things that I know about that. And that's helped me balance out a lot with the dissociative issues, because I know how to balance my emotions, and I know how to balance my physical response to my emotions, which is usually what made me dissociate. Another one of the things that made me dissociate was the kind of difference between who I was at home and who I was everywhere else. And this is already 12 minutes, so I should probably make another video talking about that. But there was definitely a difference between when I was Asia, which is my birth name, and when I was Ezra. And a difference in who I felt like I could be, who I was emotionally, I'll say, how I emotionally responded to things. I'll go into detail on that later, because otherwise this will be like 20 minutes long. So I'm going to cut it here, because otherwise I'll keep talking. And I'll write it down, because I got a list, actually, because some people are actually sending me like topics and stuff like that, questions they want me to answer, stuff they want me to talk about. I actually have a list of all that stuff. So if I haven't gotten to it yet, I promise you I will. Just give me some time, because the list is already like 6 things long. And I only really have time to do videos weekly. But if you've been keeping up, thank you for watching. If this is your first time, thank you for watching. Tell a friend if you enjoyed this. If you have any feedback, if you have any topics you want me to talk about, if you have any questions you want to ask me, I've been on testosterone now for almost a year and a month on the 25th. And like I said, I've been through a lot, man. I mean, spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally. A lot has happened in this last year. And I want to be vulnerable with you all about it. I want to be open about it. I want to be honest, so that you have another look into what transition is like. Because it's not all flowers on the other side. You know, there's there's not all flowers on the other side. I like to think of myself as a wildflower, because people always consider those to just be weeds, and you know, you got to pick them up, but they're still beautiful anyway, and they still grow regardless, and that's the most beautiful part about them. And a lot of times people make it seem like once you transition it's all roses, but they don't talk about the thorns, and that's the issue. So I'm trying to make sure that I give a full picture of what my transition has been like specifically, because I can only speak for me. I can't speak for what everyone's trans experience is going to be. But it's important to me that I'm very vulnerable. I'm sorry, I'm coming down with a cold. It's important to me that I'm very open and vulnerable with you all about it. So if you have any questions, any comments, any topics you want me to discuss, any of that stuff, hit me up with it. I promise you I'll get to it. I'll respond as soon as I can. And yeah, if you watch this, thank you. I love you. See you next week.